Okay, so here we are. Okay, someone asked about my pictures before, and so I'm going to say that the childhood pictures, these are actually pictures of my son when he was that age, in the early childhood age. So we're transitioning from my grandchild to my own son, who I may say, and this is just something to plug in there for all of you who are just doing. You're the first generation, and you're looking at people who are looking at you and seeing what you're doing. And I want to express the importance of this. When I went through school, I was first generational high school. I was first generational college, and everything we know about my family history, I'm the first person in my family to get a doctorate degree. Okay. So I started this trend, I think, with my family. But just so you know, the influence that it does have on our kids. I have a beautiful stepdaughter who has her associate's degree in early childhood education because her mother set that example for her. My son is in Colorado. He's trying to finish his PhD in physics. He's in his third year. He's going to graduate this spring. And he attributes what he's doing to watching me go through what I went through. He's taken some better financial advice than I did, so he won't end up in the darkness of school loans, but that's a different story and one not necessary for this class. But I just want to just say this, what you're doing here, if you're first generation and you don't think no one's watching, guess what? Someone is watching. Keep up the good work, make it happen, make it strong. This photo was actually taken because my son was born and we did family housing at the university that I went to. This is actually a column that is on top of a mountain of that university. And so I just want to encourage you, if you're in this and you're the first, or even if you're the second, it has an important impact on your kids. So keep up the good work. Okay. So the first thing that I want to talk about when it comes to physical growth is the body dysmorphia, as we would call it. Okay. If you'll notice over here at birth, our body, we have an oversized head and pretty much an undersized body. Okay. And then as we go through the early childhood years up to, in this case, 6.5, we still have slightly an oversized head and compared to the adult body. It's not until about 15.5 where our body, our quote unquote childhood body actually starts to look like what we would assume to be an adult body. The reason this is important is I'm going to draw a red line here. Because something that happens between 6.5 years of age and 15.5 years of age is something called puberty. Okay. These two bodies between birth and 6.5 years of age are both male and female body dysmorphia compared to adult body. It's not until after puberty that we see sex differences between children. And so let me explain what I mean by that. Before about the age of 9, if you were to give a boy and a girl the same haircut, the same clothing, and the same mannerisms, you would not be able to tell the difference between the girl and the boy. Because technically, biologically, before the age of 9, we're what we're called androgynous, meaning that we don't have the secondary sex features such as the breast, the hair, all of those things that tell us the difference between a male and a female. Okay. Anything that we see below this period, and we'll talk about this when we get to emotional social development, anything we see below about the age of 9 is something that we socialize children into. So the only reason we can tell the difference between a male and a female under the age of 9 is because of the way we dress them, the way we treat them, and the way we socialize them. That's the only way we can tell the difference. We can't do it on a biological basis. Okay, and so I just want to bring that up because when we get to social emotional development and we start talking about identity development and all of those things, this plays a major role in that conversation. Okay, the other thing that we look at is growth. Okay, so if we look at here at ages, and we're at 2, and then we're at 10, and remember, we're going to stop here at 8, but you can see the trend continues. Okay, is you remember that between the ages of 0 and 2, and in this case we can say about 3, we have rapid growth. Our bodies double in size, our brain mass quadruples, all of those things. But you'll notice this age group that we're talking about, the physical growth actually starts to slow. Okay, and then when we get to about the age of 10, when the BMI starts to be set and everything, we start to see a rapid growth in the teen years. And I'll do that with an arrow right here. And so when we're talking about physical growth, and in this period that we're talking about, we're actually talking about a slow in growth physically. Not in the brain system, but actually physically. Our growth actually decreases for a period of time. And then around the age of 8, 9 years old, it starts to shoot up again. Because it's around 8 to 9 that we actually start going through puberty. Now, let me explain this for a minute. Most of the time, we define puberty as, for example, the female's first menstruation cycle. Okay, but that's not that's just a marker of when, for example, women go from having a child body to having a reproductive adult body. But puberty is actually about a 3 to 4 year process, and usually starts around the age of 8 and ends in our culture ends around the age of 11. But there's a lot of determinants about that we'll get to when we get to that section about when people go through to puberty, and we'll find out that it's actually more social, not biologic, why people physically mature and have to do with the situation. And so the thing that I want to emphasize, though, is the period that we're talking about, we're actually going through a slower growth period. Okay. The reason why we think we're going through that slower is because the brain processes that are happening are so dynamic at this point that the brain can't focus on physical growth during this period. It has to focus on the cognitive and socio-emotional development at this point. And so, but we'll get into that when we get to those 2 sections. But what I want to emphasize is during this period, the body de-emphasizes physical growth and emphasizes socio-emotional and cognitive growth. So kind of keep those things in mind as we move forward into the other 2 areas of development that we're concerned with. One of the things that we do know happens during this period of early childhood is awareness of the body. Okay, so after the age of about 2, we have an increase of what's called proprioception. Proprioception is our understanding of where our body is physically in space and time and relation to other people. Okay, so this exponentially grows during this period when we're starting to become more independent, taking care of our own self and whatnot, and our understanding of where I am and where you are it becomes cognizant. During this period, we notice that there's some people who get more attention, and there's some people who get less attention in time and space. And so children who start to see that, hey, little Billy over here gets all the attention and I don't, there must be something wrong with my physical body. There's something wrong with me. Okay, so during this period of time, we see self-awareness comes to body image. This is where we're going to see body image becoming an issue. And you remember at the beginning of the semester, we kind of talked about this as far as going into adolescence and whatnot, is this is a time period where a child is going to determine what is the appropriate body I should have and what is the inappropriate body that I should not have, and what are the consequences of me not living up to that body image, okay? And we find, if you go back here, remember, children are not always comparing to children. We have a dysmorphous body right here when we're comparing to the social norms of an adult body. So during this period when we're supposed to be, have that small nose, the chin, the eyes, the long torso, we don't biologically have that during these age groups. And so children start to recognize that, especially when they're exposed to a lot of adult images. They start to recognize that, and this is why in this age group, we actually have a lot more negative views about their own body image. In fact, when we get to adolescence, we all think about body image and we think about eating disorders. We think about all of those issues with that. That doesn't start in adolescence. This is something important that I want everyone to understand. An adolescent with an eating disorder, that disorder did not start in adolescence. That disorder started between the age of 2 and 6. And until we address that on the family level, because the family is what's most important during this age group, and what the family projected towards that child, and the information that child was receiving during their early childhood days, and we don't work on that and correct that, it's not going to help the adolescent in their adolescent years. And so we got to keep that in mind. The other thing that we do, because we become aware of our body, is we start to explore a sense of sexuality. We start to touch parts of our body and we start to go, oh, that feels good. Because right there's 1 million to 2 million nerve endings that stimulate the dopamine areas of my brain. Okay. This is another important point, just as well as self-awareness and body image. What we have found is if parents take the opportunity to help the child understand their body parts, rather than shaming them for curiosity or telling them, hey, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be explaining why it feels good and when it's appropriate, not appropriate to do that, dependent upon your culture. But the thing that we find is that the earlier and the more comfortable a parent is about talking about sexuality, the less likely it is that they will experiment sexually in their adolescence year. They'll become a teen parent, and they tend to hold off on sexual activity well into their 18, 20s, and 23 years of age. So we have this idea that we should hide sexuality from children because for some reason as adults, we're uncomfortable with it. And it's our own uncomfortableness that prevent us from having active conversation with children. But we find that parents who will actively talk to their children about their body and about why it feels good, and then talk about boundaries, and then talk about all of those things, not shaming, those children tend to not be the children who tend to end up being teen parents, who tend up to having high risk sexual activity, who tend to hold off having sex until later years. Why? Because when we get to the adolescent section, we'll find out that the majority of the reasons why adolescents will engage in high risk sexual behaviors is because they're curious about sex. But if you talk to your child from an early age and on about it, they don't have that curiosity. They're not curious about what's going to happen. They know what's going to happen. And then they can make the cognitive decision that, well, this produces that. And if I'm not careful, it can do this. And is it appropriate for me, given my family values and my family situation? They're more likely to say, no, I'm not going to enter into that high risk behavior. I'm going to hold off until it's right for me. So, but we do have to understand that during this age group, and we kind of talked about this with Freud in the theory section, this is where children are starting to gain a sense of sexuality. If it's shameful and it's harmful, when they become adolescents and they become curious, they're going to hide it, they're going to be ashamed of it, and they're going to enter into high-risk behaviors. If they're made to feel comfortable with it and with their body and with everything else, the more likely when they get to adolescence, they'll make the choice to hold off until a later age and do it more carefully because they don't have that curiosity. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that up as an important point when we talk about self-awareness of body image and we talk about human sexuality when it comes to the physical aspects of the human condition. All right, this is where we got into ACEs. And so I do want to talk about during this childhood through exploration, children tend to get into a lot of things that they probably shouldn't. And so I want to just talk about some of the risks. So if we notice, and I do want to note this, I want you to note motor vehicle deaths. I want you to note playground deaths. I want you to note drowning. And I want you to know fire and burning. Okay. And why have those things been going down instead of up? And I want you to think about this. If you rent a house, your landlord is required to make sure that there's fire alarms in the house. If you go to a playground, they've now been redesigned to make sure if a child falls, they'll fall safely. If we look at motor vehicles, regulation behind seat belts, behind car safety has increased. And if we look at drowning, I look at the example here in Tucson where there's this news channel who does, all the news channel do some type of anti-drowning. There's the whole, you got to put a fence around your pool. There's a whole social media aspect that goes into this. And so what I'm trying to say in this, and I'm not pro-regulation or anything else, but when we create social consciousness as adults, we tend to make it so children don't suffer as much, in this case, as far as death. Okay. But let's look at the things that have been on the increase. Suffocation, poisoning are two major ones that are up. Okay. Suffocation is when a child is in a crib inappropriately. We see the increase of suffocation increase. Okay. Coming from the social attitude that more softness, more thing creates more comfort. And so why would you want to take that away? Poisoning. What you do with chemicals in your house is not highly regulated. It's regulated in a restaurant, it's regulated in other industries, but in our own personal homes, this is the one place where regulation or social regulation has not taken place. And we see that these are on the increase, while the others are on the decrease. Okay, so I just want to bring this up. I want you to recognize that the risk to our children are not because of our children. It's because of the decisions we make, which we say are up to an individual, how you keep your house, how you keep your child's bedding, versus social, drowning, vehicles, playgrounds, fire, all of those things that we have decided we need to regulate on a social level, whether with laws or with social norms. But these other two, people say, no, these two areas are too private. There's no place for the social world to be saying you should do this or you should do that. And so we see these on the continued increase. Okay. So now let's talk about abuse. And this comes exactly from the Adverse Childhood Experience study, where again, we measure children. And the thing that I want to note here, and this is an important note to make, there's a difference between what children and adults report on a confidential survey versus the reporting to law enforcement. And I'll show this here in just a minute as we move along. So what do we find when people can just report something without fearing someone's going to find out? Okay. We find that 1 in 4 children will be physically abused. I'm just letting that sink in. 1 in 5 children will be sexually abused. 1 in 10 children will be emotionally abused or physically neglected. 14%, that's 1.5 out of every 10, will be what's called emotionally neglected. Emotionally neglected means that the parents don't value things like their education, don't value their opinion, don't value any of those things that as a society we value as adults, but we don't give that same precedence for children. And let's look at our country, because this is kind of depressing to me. When we compare our country to the 26 modern countries, and I get this all the time, well, they're not as bad as Mexico, it's not as bad as Brazil, it's not as bad as Africa. And the thing that I ask people to do, are those the countries that we should be comparing the United States of, one of the world powers? We should be comparing ourselves to Mexico or South America or Africa? I don't think so. A more appropriate comparison is the 26 countries who produce what we produce as far as wealth, as far as modernization, as far as technology. And what we find is of the 26 modern countries that fit that, the United States, China, and Britain have the worst records of child welfare and abuse. In fact, this year, I read a report that came out in Psychological Science. United States and Britain, or United Kingdom, or England, whatever you want to call it, we're tied. And I don't know if we should be proud that we're tied this year for having the worst child welfare and abuse record of any of the 26 modern countries. And just to give a realization of this, if you haven't taken social work 171, or if you're not or anything, you may not know this, but did you know that it was actually the animal rights people who promoted children's rights in the United States? Indeed, animals have more rights in the United States as children. You abuse an animal, you're looking at a felony. You abuse a child, you're looking at a misdemeanor. I want you to allow that to sink in. You go and physically abuse your pet dog or your pet cat, you're committing a felony. You abuse your own child in your own house, the most you're looking at is misdemeanor and probation. Okay, and I just want to put this out there because everyone thinks, oh, the United States is a great place, wonderful place, well, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, if we compare ourselves to Mexico and especially Southern Africa, we look wonderful. And it's no wonder that we have people crossing the border because it does look better. But again, when we compare ourselves to other countries like Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Italy, we're not the safest country for our children to be in modern countries. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox and just say this. We have the ability to change this, but it has to start at our cultural level. People say, well, I take care of my child, and so I don't give a shit about everybody else's child. I've heard that time and time again. Okay, that's such an individualistic approach that the only thing that matters to me is my success, and then my child will be successful because I taught them to be independent and strong individuals. Okay, I want you to think about the backwards thinking that is. I really do. I hope you do. But we have to start promoting a social change. We have to say that our children, all of them are important, not just ours. We have to recognize that a child's life is more valuable than livestock and your pet. All of these things have to start at a cultural level. And we have the ability to do that if we have the guts and the ability. And I hope everyone in this classroom does, because, you know, we're having a lot more children born today, and there's going to be a lot more children abused today. So child maltreatment. So approximately 6.3 million reports of child abuse are reported to what was originally called CPS. Each state uses a different term now, but basically the Child Protection Services per year. However, on average, only 3 million of those cases are investigated between the age of 2 to 7. So we have 6.3 million reports of child abuse, but less than half of them actually get investigated. Okay, and what do we find for our age group, for individuals when an investigation does happen? And you'll notice that these numbers are almost swapped with what we find when a person can confidentially report what's happened to them. You remember when they confidentially, this was like at 20%, 1 in 5. Okay, neglect was far less when it was reported on a survey. And when we talk about physical maltreatment, you remember that was number 3 on the report list. Okay, but I want you to think about this, why this is so prevalent here in the United States. It's really easy to prove neglect. All right, you look at what the family brings in financially and what they're putting in as resources to the child. You look at how many days the parent keeps them out of school. You do all those kinds of things. They're very quantifiable measures. But when you're dealing with things like physical and psychological and sexual maltreatment on a legal level, you're dealing with what they call she said, he said, or he said, she said. You're dealing with people's experiences. On the sexual abuse end, yes, we've done a little bit better with our technology on the biology end, but we have such a backlog of sexual abuse kits that have been done. We call these now cold cases. Okay, physical abuse, you have to have a definite reason beyond a child falling down or a child having an accident to call it physical abuse. To call it psychological maltreatment is even worse. That's even harder to prove. Because you could look at how often the parent allows the child to go to school and stuff like that. But how do you measure that psychological impact and not blame it on something else besides where that child is being raised and where that child is being developed from? So where we are, and this is one of the reasons why the United States is in the bottom. We have 6.3 million reports. We have 3 million investigated, and we only prove those that are easy to prove. Those who are not, we kind of say, okay, I don't see evidence for this, blah, 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 so it must not be happening. So this is one of those other issues that we have in the inconsistency between reporting and what individuals state on a confidential survey. When we look at fatalities, and if we come out here, if we come out here, this trend hasn't changed much. You'll notice that here in 2007 to 2009, we had a huge increase. And so I'll explain that here in just a minute. When we look at murder rates in the United States, every single matrix is going down. So murder between adults is going down. Murder because of infidelity, murder, they're all going down. The one type of a murder that is consistently going up is child murders. Parents murdering their own children, okay? And we've seen this is more of a fatality due to child maltreatment. But we've seen this trend. If you'll notice, the trend line is continually increasing, okay? And the question becomes, why are we murdering our children, but we're murdering adults less? And there's a couple reasons that have been proposed. One is the frustration theory, where parents weren't exactly prepared to be parents. They weren't taught how to be parents, so they get frustrated, and so that results in eliminating that child who is that source of frustration. That's one theory that has been proposed. Other theories include economic theories about if we look at the natural world, for example, and let's say we'll use just an example of a pack of wolves. So a mother has children, and let's say the survivability in their domain is not that high, so the mom will purposely kill the weakest links within the little pack that she's raising. And we find this across species. And we look at, the human condition, and we wonder, yes, we have these high cognitive capacities and stuff like that, but are we just giving in to our natural intention, saying, you know what, there's not enough resources in this world for my child, it's better to let them go than to keep them here because it's going to continue the competition. That's a whole argument that's outside of the scope of this class, but those are some ideas that have been proposed. Okay, I want to explain this jump in trends right here between 2007 and 2009, and it all has to do with something that occurred in 2001, which was 9/11, okay? After 9/11, what we saw for at least the next, if we count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, is we saw a huge amount of solidarity. Everyone felt a part of the American experience. We had what's called a superordinate goal. Everyone in the United States wanted to make sure the United States was safe, but we also wanted to hold those people who were accountable for what has happened. So when we look at these years between 2001 to 2007, we see the lowest rates of hate crimes. We see the lowest rates of prejudice. We see the lowest rates of economic prejudice, all of those things, the lowest rates in probably about 70 years, since about the 2020s into the 1920s into the 1930s, okay? But what we get here is what's called a rebound effect, okay? This isn't the normal rates for us here in the United States. Our normal rate is a high rate. So what we see when we start to see people start to be mean towards each other, starts to become prejudice against each other again, when we see all of this division, if you remember right here is when we start talking about immigration again, especially in 2009. And then again, when we see these rates increase in later years. And so we see this large, what's called rebound effect in child maltreatment and fatality rates because of a response to an abnormal, peaceful cultural time in the United States. Okay. So with that being said, and we'll end with this tonight, what are some of the things that put children at higher risk of being abused? And we're going to look at the dynamics of father and mother, and both mother and father. Now, there are a lot of other risks. There's social economic risk, there's poverty risk, there's all of those different risks, and I'm not denying those. But the things that we have control over right here in this moment is an active mother and an active father. Those are things that we control as people who produce children. Okay, so what is the risk factor for a child being abused with mother? This one's kind of an interesting thing, is if a child is born to a mother between the age of 18 to 23, that greatly increases the chances that their child will be abused physically, sexually, emotionally, or psychologically, or maltreated. In fact, this is the biggest age group of risk as far as age is considered. In fact, the state of Hawaii in the 1990s, I believe it is, had one of the highest child abuse rates in the United States. And they started what's called a home visitation program, where if a mother came to the hospital and she was between the age of 18 to 23, they would assign a nurse to that mother. That nurse would go to their house every week. And not only would they check on the physical well-being of the child, they would offer parenting lessons. They would offer how to handle different issues that are coming up with the mother's infant. And within about 2 generations, so we're talking about a 10-year lifespan, a 10-year span of time, Hawaii's abuse rates went to one of the highest in the United States to one of the lowest in the United States, by having people go in and work with these mothers on a professional level, helping them establish healthy boundaries with partners, helping them understand what their child is going through, all of those things. And that reduced that risk among these children that were born to mothers between this age group. What are the risk factors as far as fathers? Well, an absent father is a big warning sign of child abuse. Now, I'll bring this to light when I work with child sexual abuse. There is no denying that a biological father could sexually abuse their child, if not physically abuse their child. I'm not saying that cannot happen. There are fathers in a household that do that, but there's also mothers in the household that do that. But what I'm trying to say with this risk factor is the absence of fathering. It's not the absence of a father, meaning the physical presence of a male being. It's the absence of the unique fathering role that put children at risk for abuse. And so what do I mean about the fathering role? Mothers tend to give love unconditionally. They tend to love their children no matter what, their successes, their failures, blah, blah, blah. They love that child to the tens. Fathers, on the other hand, love conditionally, meaning that they set conditions for someone to achieve in order to have that love, in order to have that attention. Okay, and I want you to think about this. as an adult, because a lot of people go, well, no, fathers should love unconditionally, blah, 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 blah. I want you to think about how high productive an assembly line in a factory would be if a supervisor came along and said, oh, you're okay. I know you're having a bad day. You don't need to do your part. You don't have to be successful. I'll love you anyways. I'll employ you regardless of how you perform. That's kind of the mothering role. She's supposed to set that nurturing, caring environment up, and they do it quite well. So when we talk about safe places, safe boundaries, that's mom. That's who on average go to for that. When I'm in trouble, I need to go to mom and seek that comfort out. When it comes to dad or fathers, it's, yes, I can go to him. He will protect me, but he also is setting conditions for me. He's saying, in life, I need to be this, 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 and that. And he's setting boundaries. Now, what does that boundary setting do? When that child gets into a situation where they may be sexually abused, where they may be physically abused, because they have that boundary, they're less likely to say, to allow that person to violate them in some way. They'll go to their father, they'll go to their mother, they'll tell mom and dad what happened. But if you have an absent father and your mother is not at a maturity level that can deal with that, that's when you have issues. Now, again, when I talk about this, I want to be very clear. There are a lot of 18 to 23-year-old women who are very, very mature and can handle children. I'm talking about on average, what do we see as the risk factors? Okay, so I just want to bring that up. And there are some dads who provide unconditional love, but between the mother and the father, they then set up conditions of how the child should think about their world, how the child should think about themselves, how they should hold themselves to a certain standard and not allow people to violate those standards. Child abuse is not the child's fault. I've said this, and I worked in the field for several years. Child abuse is a function, a product of the abuser, the mother, and the father, not the child. And I just want to bring that up. Okay, so what about when we combine mother and father? So when there's a mother and father in place, what are some things or that are there? And when I say in place, it doesn't mean that they live together. It doesn't mean they're married, but how well do they get along with each other? How do they take care of the child? And this comes to the stability of a relationship. So even with divorce, can the parents maintain some type of quorum, some type of conduct to make sure that there's some stability for that child as they go through that transition? Toxicity in intimate relationship, and you'll notice that I also put toxicity between mother and father. Toxicity between intimate partners means it can be toxicity between the mother and the father, but it can also be toxicity between the mother and the mother's new boyfriend, the mother's new husband, or the father and the father's new wife, new girlfriend. And we can extend this on boyfriend, girlfriend for either what, however that works out. If there's that level of toxicity, meaning that they're always harming each other, regardless of the health of the other relationship. So let's take a stereotypical. Mom is now with a new husband, dad is with a new wife. If there's toxicity between the father and the wife, that's still going to put the child more at risk of abuse, even if the mother and the new father have a healthy relationship. And this comes to the third point, toxicity between the mother and the father. So this is when they're married, but this is also when they're separate. The most common version of toxicity between mothers and fathers is when divorced parents start to use the child against the other parent. So they start saying, well, what did dad say about me this weekend? Or what did mom say? You can't believe your mom. You can't believe your dad. You're late for visitation. Oh, you're not supposed to be here that day. Oh, and there's this toxicity that occurs. And in this case, I'll bring this up. Mom and dad may be in a new, completely healthy relationship. They may have new partners that are completely healthy. But if there's toxicity between those two, this still will increase the risk of abuse to that child. Stability and situation. Stability is probably a good example of this is the more often a parent moves from place to place, the higher risk. There's a correlation between abuse and moving. Okay. And we see this big with, for example, military families. The military has had to invest millions and millions of dollars into domestic violence and child abuse. And really, kind of technically, the scientific reason is because in those situations, there's never a sense of stability. They're moving from base to base, from calling to calling, and those kinds of things. And that creates the condition of instability, which then we tend to take that out on our spouse or our children. Okay. And so this is another level of how stable is a child in their situation and in their place. And are we providing them with where they belong and where their place is? Okay. The next one on the parent mother level is response to stress and change. If either parent have a negative response to stress or change in their life, this then increases the risk of abuse of the child. Okay. Now these other two kind of they have some caveats to them. Okay. One is education level. The higher the education, the lower risk of child abuse. The caveat in this is relationship violence, such as domestic violence. Education level does not predict spousal or relationship abuse. It does predict child abuse, but not relationship adult abuse. So I just want to bring that up. And then view of being a parent. Okay, so there's some parents who became parents by mistake. There's some parents who did it because they thought that that's what was socially appropriate. There's some parents who had children just because of that opportunity they had in that moment. All right. The view you have as yourself as a parent can increase or decrease the chance of child abuse. If you have a positive view about parenting, a positive view about interaction between the child and the parent, that can lower the probability of a child abuse. But if you're like, God, I got to get up and parent again tomorrow. Oh, I can't wait till that kid goes to bed. She or he needs help with the homework again. I'm so exhausted. I like my time alone, so I like sending the kids to grandma and grandpa because that gives me time. I want you to relate that to the view those individuals who make that statement have about raising children. And the more disconnect there is between positive parenting, actually wanting to be there for the child, and wanting to be on that more selfish end and be there just for me, the higher the risk of abuse. Okay, so these are the factors. And the reason why I bring up these factors instead of social economics or poverty or anything else is these are all factors we have control over. We have the ability to say or make changes for. Even when it comes to toxicity of relationships, you can lower your risk of your child being abused if you model a healthy, intimate relationship and you differentiate that between your ex-spouse and what's going on with your ex-spouse and what's going on with the new stepmom or the stepdad or step partner, okay? And making those differentiations can be helpful to children in these types of situations. And probably one of the things that I learned very early on when it comes to child abuse, and it's something that's stuck to me ever since, there was a series of research done in around 2008. It was published around 2009, 2010. And it looked at the adverse effects of child sexual abuse. And as you could probably guess, there's a lot of psychological, social, and biological issues that happen with children who have been sexually abused. And those symptoms of abuse are either not addressed, or they're barely addressed, or they're addressed in the wrong way. Okay. But, and this is one of the most interesting statistics to me, because I've worked with both adults and children who have suffered from sexual abuse. And I've always looked at ways, how can children and adults not suffer so much from that? Well, there's an interesting statistic. Okay. If you want to reduce the negative impacts of child sexual abuse, there's only one thing you need to do as an adult. And it will reduce the negative effect by 92%. Meaning greater than 9 in 10 children, if you do this, will not have the negative psychological and social consequences of child sexual abuse. And all it is when a child reveals that to you, you simply say, I believe you, and I'll do everything I can do to protect you. And I can tell you how I can do that. So if you're a professional, you can say, this is how I can do this. If you're a parent, you can say, but the important part is that first phrase. The 92%er occurred when an adult, one individual adult, said, I believe you. That can reduce the negative effects of child sexual abuse by 92%. And I want you to think about how much responsibility that puts on each and every one of you if you have a child who comes to you. Because the instant instinct, especially when it's a person close to us, such as a close brother or sister who is an uncle and aunt to our child, or is our biological, who is a biological parent, or is the boyfriend or girlfriend that we're fallen in love with. Our first instinct is to believe the adult. I'm going to say this. Our first instinct in those situations is to believe the adult and give the adult the doubt. That I will tell you, I've heard this time and time again. The greatest defender of a person who abuses a child is the parent of the abuser and the intimate partner of the abuser. The two people who should be protecting that child are the greatest defenders of the abuser. All right, so next time, I want you to put this in your mind. The next time a child comes and tells you someone's touching them or someone is treating them in an inappropriate way, I want you to remember these words. I believe you, and I'm here for you. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. I believe you, and I'm here for you. And 92% of the time, that's all it takes for us then to make sure that that child doesn't have the negative consequences of what has happened to them. And I want you all to keep that in mind when you're working with children. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I know this is a very tough topic.